Hello, test, hey. Well, welcome everyone. Long day today, of course, and I think it's one of the last sessions, so we'll finish it off with a bang. We're talking today about controlling and managing your information access with DataStoreDSX. I've worked with John for the past 5 years or so with high tech and then with Mitra Tech. So John knows inside and out everything you need to know about DSX. So hopefully you find this very informative and you enjoy yourselves throughout the session. So without further ado, let me introduce you to John Dedman.
Thanks very much, Tom. I hate pictures of myself, but I've got to start with one because there needs to be a bio up on there at the front, apparently. So yes, as Tom mentioned, I've been with High Tech and then Mitra Tech for around, actually it's probably closer to 6 years now. Basically, I started off working with DataStore from a development aspect. I've now moved through to be one of the sales consultants representing DataStore and going out and giving demonstrations of it. What I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about how DataStore can be used for managing information content in business. I'm going to talk about a couple of scenarios around how it can be used. The idea of DataStore, though, is that it's a very flexible product, and we'll come on to a few of the areas that can be used for later on. I'm going to go through a demonstration that's going to talk to the two scenarios that I've put up on the screen at the moment. If you have any questions at any point or you want me to go into a bit more detail as we're going through, please feel free to shout out and let me know. If you let Tom know as well, he can bring over the microphone so we can get the audio recorded. So let's start with talking about the information governance challenges. So I was in a session earlier on today with Laurie Fisher from HBR, who has a brilliant description of exactly what information governance is. So I thought I'd start by reading that out, and hopefully I've written it down correctly. So it's interdepartmental and interstructure processing to satisfy information compliance, managing information risks while optimizing information value. So it's not just about the documents you store, it's not just about how it's stored and categorized in the system and how it's accessed. It's also about what you can do to either benefit the processes that are going on in your business and also about how you manage that data and maybe get some value from it around the outside of just the normal day-to-day processes. In terms of what's going on with the structure that we're holding, I've put up on the slide here a few elements about what do you need to manage around your documents? How do you control that? How do you process that? How are we picking up data? How are we gathering it in? How are we storing and categorizing it? How is it being processed? What flags do we need to put in place around data security and data privacy? We've had a couple of sessions on GDPR today, but obviously that's only one particular regulation that requires you to enforce how data is accessed and controlled. There are many others out there. But it's an ever-increasing challenge to be able to make sure that you meet all those regulations. One of those elements that comes up around that is how data is retained and how it's managed. So it's not just about the process that's currently going on, but what happens when that process ends? What happens when we need to remove that data? One of the key things that Laurie pointed out was we want to minimize the data footprint when we're talking about how we manage the data that's in our business. We want to remove any duplication of data. We want to make sure that we understand that we're only holding what we need to hold and nothing more. And there's a few processes built into DataStore that can help you do that, so I want to touch on those in a bit more detail. But how can DataStoreDSX actually help? Well, there's 4 elements that I want to talk about today around flexibility, security, process, and governance. In terms of flexibility and adaptability, what DataStore allows you to have is a completely flexible architecture for how you hold your documents. It's not an enforced, we must hold this piece of information. It's purely down to the data that needs to be held and how it's categorized in the business. We can isolate elements. So, for example, if we're storing HR documents as part of the system, those can be isolated and put to one side and only accessed by people with the rights around the outside of it. We can also build a business framework for how you manage your data. You can build process into how the data is collected, how it's categorized, and how it's stored. And we can also expand to suit how business evolves over time. What is right for you today might not be right for you in 5 years' time. So you need a solution that's going to enable you to grow how your data is stored and controlled appropriately to how your business changes over time. From the security aspect, I've already touched on it partially about content access. How do we make sure that we're getting the information to the people that need it to do their jobs, but we're minimizing the chance of any data breach or people accessing information they shouldn't have access to? How can we limit down the number of people that are getting access to those documents? And where we are getting those, how do we make sure that we understand who's accessing those documents and when they're being accessed? With DataStore, we've got a lot of traceability and audit built into the system that I'll come onto a bit more during the demonstration. But the idea is we can give you a clear picture of exactly how that data is being used and how it's being accessed by people over time. We can also use it to track how process is occurring. One of the elements I'll come on to in the next element, process and integration, is around how we can build processes around documents into the system. But the idea is about being able to have traceability of that as well, get a clear understanding of what's going on. Around process and integration, we can support and expand on existing processes that are available, currently being used in your business, to be able to organize and categorize and support those processes with individual document processes that help tailor specific requirements or enforce particular process around approval processes or elements like that. I'll come on and touch on those more in the demonstration as well. But the important bit is being able to enforce those procedures. If we have to have had certain people accessing a document and approving a document before it's made available to be used in a process, we can track and determine that's actually occurred, and we can make sure, again, that we've got an audit and traceability around the outside of that to put that into effect. We also have the capability to support e-discovery processes. We're not offering DataStore as an e-discovery solution. We're talking about managing the data that's held inside DataStore and making it available to e-discovery processes and legal hold processes around the outside. The system has the capability to be able to go in and talk to those systems and integrate with them to make sure that we've got the level of control and access around the outside. Not just from e-discovery perspective, but also from the perspective of other line of business systems that are going on. We talked about HR documentation earlier. There might be an HR system in place managing exactly the processes that are going on around that. What DataStore can do is integrate that to make sure that we've got that information coming back when you're viewing the documents or supplying those documents to be accessed through the application as well. And the last element is around governance and compliance. Now, this is an area that's fairly wide-ranging, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it in terms of how we can support every single regulation. But the idea is that with a centralized source of information that DataStore can give you, it makes it much easier to manage those and govern those pieces of information that's being held. We can also give an understanding of what data is actually being held and whether it's the right data. So have we got the latest version of documents? Have we got the correct documents for managing the process that we're going through? We can also get an understanding of how that data has been used in terms of the audit and traceability around the outside, and we can use it to report on how compliant you are with the data that's being held in the system. So I'll come on to a bit about what we can do around the outside of the system as well. To give you an idea of the scenarios that I wanted to discuss today, the two that I'm going to go through are firstly contract management. So I'm going to talk about the processes that need to go in place around how you manage your contract documents. One of the things that's very key is making sure that you have contract templates to try and simplify the process and ensure that the right terms and conditions are going into processes. So I'll talk about a bit about how that can be handled. I'll also talk about the approval process, as I mentioned. How can we get the relevant people to attest or confirm that this information can be sent out and the contract is correct. We also have supporting documents around any contract. What do we need to have to allow this to go through? Not only are we talking about particularly the master agreement that's going on, we might need to put in place non-disclosure agreements, we might need to put in place other sorts of forms and requisitions around the outside to make sure the whole contract can be executed correctly. We can store all the supporting communications that are going on. If you're doing a back and forth on a particular section of a non-disclosure agreement with a third party, again, how do we track that, how do we process that, and how can we pick it up and use it? And also, I'm going to talk about how we can integrate with systems to, again, provide that flow of information between what's held in DataStore and the processes that are going on in other systems. The second scenario is around an employee onboarding process. So again, we're talking about similar sort of requirements to the contract processing. We're going to have to make sure that we've got the right information around the employees. We've got to make sure that we have the relevant information in terms of approvals around job descriptions and other pieces of information that's going on. We also want to make sure that resumes and CVs are processed by the relevant people that are appropriate to validate and confirm what's there. And again, we might need to integrate with an HR system to be able to pull information back and make sure that we've got the relevant flows going on. And then we've also got the capability to go in and talk about how documents are managed in retention policies that I'll come on to as part of this as well. So that then leads me onto this wonderful slide that says DSX demo, which means I've now got to try and get the screen working in the right way. So bear with me 2 seconds while I bring that up. And this is when I find out it's on the other side. There it is. So in terms of what DataStoreDSX can provide, I'm going to structure what I'm talking through around the 4 points that I discussed earlier on, so the flexibility, security, the process, and the governance side as well. So let's start off with the documents around particular contract management. Apologies, let me just bring this up. So I'm going to be accessing particular contract documents because I'm working on an agreement with a third party around how I want to process the documents and how we're managing data that's being transferred to them or other classifications around that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to have a look for the particular types of information that I'm interested in. So in this case, I've identified that I'm looking for particular contracts around a third party provider's processes. So I'll go in and perform a search. What that'll do is that'll go away and query all of the documents in the system to pull back the relevant information that I've asked for, whether it's dependent on a particular contract or a wide range. So what I've done here is pull back information from every single third-party contract that I'm looking at. And we can see there's a number of different types of documents here around NDAs, RFPs, master agreements, and so on and so forth. I've also got some communication that's come back around that. So where I'm going to be working with understanding exactly what's going on through this process of managing this contract and releasing it, I can go in and access that information and pull that back. In this case, what I've actually got in here is a pair of emails communicating on a particular paragraph inside the NDA that allows us to do some red line checking and information around the outside of it. But the idea is that all of the different document types that I'm processing can be pulled back here. So DataStore can hold a wide array of content to suit the needs that you have around the relevant processes that are going on. In addition to that, we also have the capability to manage how documents are versioned. When you're talking about a contract document, it's very important to be able to have versions of those documents present in the system, have a history of exactly how that contract has evolved over time. So if we go and have a look at this particular document up here, I can actually see that there's been multiple versions of this document. If I go in and have a look at the document history, I can actually go and then do comparisons on those two versions of documents as well. So I can go in and compare the red lines between the two documents, identify what's changed. So in the example where I'm talking about an email coming in from a third party around a particular clause, I can have an evolution of the document, including all the changes that have been agreed and put in there around the outside of that to determine actually what's going on. The idea of the versioning means that I've then got that full traceability from start to finish and make sure I've hit the relevant people when that's going through. We can collaborate on these documents as well. So the idea is that because we have the capability to check in and check out documents, we can be working with a structured content of a document as a particular version, and then that can drive through a process around the outside as well that I'll come on to a little bit later on. From the aspect of security and traceability, I've got some structure in here that there may be restrictions on what data I'm allowed to access. So if I switch back to my view up here and I go and have a look at a particular master agreement, I'm actually not allowed to see what the master agreement is because I'm only responsible for controlling the NDA that's going out. Now this is a fairly simple example where I'm not allowed to see one particular document. But again, this can be then used to categorize and make sure that the relevant security is applied to the relevant people to make sure that the wrong data isn't being accessed without the necessary rights being in place. If I don't have rights to see this at all, I won't see that document present in my results set. But it may be that I need to know that a master agreement's been signed or is at least in process of being signed with the customer as part of the processes that are going on. So the system can give me that information, but it won't actually let me see the content of that agreement. One other element that I can discuss around contracts is around how data is being used. So there is information, if I bring up another tab, I can go and have a look at the contract information around particular contract references within a particular date range, in this case. These categories can all be decided on exactly what's required for a particular business need. But if I go in and search for all of the audit history around the documents that have been processed this month, I can bring back a report of exactly who's accessed what and when. I can also go and do, in this case, a quick export to Excel to just show you what that looks like. And this will go and bring back a history of, in this case, who processed the document into the system, who stored that particular version of a document. But it also gives me traceability on who's accessed those documents and when it was accessed, to give me a complete understanding of exactly what's been processed throughout the entire flow of this. I've pushed it out to Excel in this case, but we do actually record that in our data warehousing element, so that can be reported on as well through other MI or BI tools. Just switching back to the previous view, we have the ability to do a number of things with documents if the rights have been given. So where I was in the process of talking about a particular non-disclosure agreement, maybe we've made some changes to it, we've got a new version, I want to send that back out to our third party to be able to get his feedback or agreement to it. If I have the rights to do so, we've got very simple ways of exporting this and emailing it out, and we can do some additional process on the conversion as it's going out the door. So in this case, we might be processing it as an internal Word document, but when it goes out to the third party, it's a locked-down PDF file that they won't be able to modify or amend. But we can then process that back into the system as part of their response and work on it from that point forward. We also have the ability to print and annotate the documents if the rights have been given. And all of that is controlled, again, with the audit traceability. So where any action has been performed on a document around those processes, that can all be picked up and reported on as well. In terms of what can be audited, I've shown you we audit on storage and retrieval of the documents, but we also work on who's modified any of the content associated to a document, who's added new versions of the document in the system. If and when users have the rights to do so, deletion of documents is also traced, so we can report on that and give that availability out as well. The next element was around process and integration. So what I wanted to do was talk around the approval route around a particular document. So to have a look at what that looks like, I've taken a screenshot of our system rather than digging into the administration side. This is a fairly simple process. There's only a few steps in it, but this is an NDA will go through this process to be picked up by the relevant points, to be identified whether we've been through a legal check, whether any changes are required to the process, whether it's gone through final approval before it can then be sent out to a third party. The idea is that from going through this process, at any point we can throw back changes need to be made before it's pushed out the door. But then as a new version is generated, it will go around this process again and keep being reviewed until it's gone through that final approval process. We control how a document is then accessed and made available by actually forcing it through a particular publication route. And what that's going to do is make sure that it's been approved, it's gone through those final checks, and only then will it be made available to the people that are actually going to be processing that document and moving it forward. Until then, it's an in-review process, so it's not necessarily made available to everyone. If at any point any amendments are needed, we can automatically reject that version as not valid, so it's then never accessible through any of the processing views that we have built into the system. So what does that look like in action? If I switch back to our search and client view, The idea is to try and make it as quick and easy for people to work through an approval process as required. So what I'll do is I'll bring up the routing process that's associated to this, and this is going to go back and in effect build a queue of what I have in my processing queue to be able to work on. So here I'm working on a particular version of the NDA, and from here I can go and define how it's going to go through a process. At each point, anybody interacting with the document will be able to go and say whether they approve or not, and they can either have it automatically assigning a value to why it's been approved, or if they're saying it's going to be rejected, we can define a set of reasons why it can be rejected. And we can also put in place some comments around that, so if particular changes are needed, we can highlight that to the next person in the chain. And around the outside of that, there's also notifications, so I can go and send an email to people. Oops, that's interesting. I can go and send an email to people at any point further down the chain to be able to make sure that they understand that they've now got some processing to do as well. So in this case, that's now hit our final published state, so that's now going to be made available to be accessed by the people that are going to be interacting with it, and that they can go and move forward and push that out to a third party, or in this case, a supplier. The idea is that at each point through that process, again, we're auditing and checking. So from the security side, we've got full understanding of exactly who's interacted with these documents, how they've pulled that information back, and how they're working with it. The other element that I wanted to talk around was, excuse me, template management. So template management, again, uses very much the same sort of processes here. We can go in and we can define a set of documents, templates that are made available for people that are processing things through. So if I'm a user who's going to be working on a new non-disclosure agreement, I can go into the system, I can find a version-controlled template, and then use that to create a new non-disclosure agreement that's going to be sent out to my third parties to agree on, enforcing the structure and the terms and conditions associated to that in the document, but allowing it to be refined as necessary by the people that are actually putting the non-disclosure agreement together. Once that document is processed through the system, that also then goes through approval routes. So as I create this document, I can then push it in as a non-disclosure agreement that's going to be produced. If I can't actually see the buttons very well from where I'm standing. So I can go in, view the content of a document, and then we also have ties into the Office applications to be able to go and push that document straight into DataStore from inside Word. So I can go in and make the changes, fill out the company name fields and various other elements like that, controlled as required by what you need. And I can then go in and specify that I want to push this document back in to a particular structure. The system can then go away, find the relevant information I need to go and store that information. I have control over what I'm required to put in before that document gets stored away. And as soon as I finalize this and actually store the document, that will start that approval process route. So we'll then have to go through those multiple levels of approval before we get to the end. This is actually used by one of our customers to control a number of elements around how they process things. So not just non-disclosure agreements, but they actually manage all of their communication that's going out to customers in terms of letter templates through this process. So they will go in and generate a letter, process all the information into it, store it into DataStore, and it can then go through an approval process as to how it's going to be managed as it's going through. And then at the end of the process, we also have additional output to make sure that it's routed appropriately. So in certain circumstances, we might want to just enforce that it's going down a particular route to be emailed to a client, or we might want to send a text message via SMS. So we're able to integrate with a number of different end channels as required to get that information out. The idea is, again, to be as flexible as we can be around the integrations that are required to suit the business needs. So I talked about how the types of integrations can be used. If I switch back to our contract documents view, we can see there's particular information in here that's going to be associated to information that's coming out of a third-party system. So we've actually got information up on the screen here that's associated to information that's controlled by a contract management system. So this is not information that's stored inside DataStore. DataStore knows there's a document there, but it knows only the particular reference number that this is particularly appropriate to. From that, we can go and query another system to pull back information and make sure that we're getting the right information back to the end user. So in this case, where we have the company name, the main contact for that particular contract, the email address, contact information for that contact, is not actually stored as data inside the DataStore system. It's available through the third-party links to be able to pull that information back and make sure the latest information is always available. You don't want to be managing a particular contact's email address through multiple different systems. The idea is to get that piece of information from the system where it needs to be managed and available to the people that are using the documents here. So the last element I wanted to talk about was around compliance and governance. Here we have something called a document inventory that we've put together around making sure the correct documents are present for a particular process to occur. So we've talked about, obviously, a non-disclosure agreement coming through, but overarching that, we're talking about a contract going through process. So what I'll do here is I'll go in and put in the reference number for a particular contract. Helps if I type the right letters. And what I can do is I can go in and evaluate what content we have present in the system, that whether I have enough information to be able to move forward with my process or not. So in this case, we've identified that we have documents present in the system and they're valid, but we can also classify based on business rules that are put together whether I need to have particular documents that are not present in DataStore and identify that these are missing. Or whether there's a requirement to have multiple contents of a document or multiple versions of a document. Again, it might be that I need to have provided 3 due diligence reports as part of this process to be able to move forward with it. If I only have 2 in the system, it won't let me move forward with that process by highlighting the fact that we have a problem here. The information that's coming through is again controlled in the same way as previously. So if I go and search and retrieve on all these documents that we have in the system, if I go in and have a look at the master agreement, the fact that I'm restricted to it in one particular view means it's also restricted to me here. But I need to know that it's present to be able to move forward with that process. By default, document management systems, enterprise content management systems are brilliant at telling you what they do have stored. They don't necessarily understand very well what's missing or whether you have sufficient of something present. So the idea is that we can very quickly and easily, around a particular contract process, get an identifier of whether we have the right information present. We can also build different inventories for different types. So instead of just looking at a particular contract, if I was to go in and just have a look at all the contracts that we have in here, I can then go and have a look at particular information for a particular customer process or a customer contract. And I can get that understanding that against this, I have a different set of requirements and a different set of documents present that are associated to that particular contract. So again, we're not just focusing on, I have a defined set that I need to meet. I can go in and process all of this information through, be able to go and see the documents that are associated to this particular contract and pull back what's required to make sure that I have what's necessarily present. What this also allows us to do is get an identifier for what documents are present in terms of, oops, why isn't this refreshed? So in terms of what documents are present, what do we need to do when something expires? How do we make sure that the relevant people are notified if a document is about to expire because it's now made invalid? If, for example, there's a particular period about a particular document being present, or something has to have been processed within a particular time, the inventory can be used to notify the relevant people via an escalation process, if necessary, that documents are about to expire. So it might be that 3 months before a particular document expires, we need to notify one person. A month before it expires, we go up to a higher level, and that can all be processed and built into that as well. The other side of this is the governance aspect. How do we get an understanding of not only how we're managing it for this particular contract, but how we're managing it across the board? So what I've got here is a collation of the information that's pulled up in a particular BI tool. In this case, I'm using Power BI just to show how you get the information out, but ideally this could be any BI tool that you have in business at the moment. So I can go in and have a look at the particular information associated to all of the contracts that I'm currently involved in. identifying what I've got present, what I haven't got present, what's expired, and what needs to be worked on very quickly and easily. The idea of the system is just to make sure that you have that relevant information available across the board. If any of you were in the information governance session earlier on, I talked about a particular scenario where one of our customers uses this similar process to manage their customer documents. So they were fined very heavily by the regulator for not having sufficient documents present to control the processes that were going on. And they actually got a process in place to manage not only how the documents are coming in and going through a review and approval process to get picked up, but also then feeding through a process like this to be able to report on how they are complying with those regulations over time. And they're using the capabilities of this to be able to report back to the regulator and show that they're improving the situation that they were trying to manage. So we've been through contract management and we've discussed how particular contract documents can be managed and controlled through DataStore. But the idea is that, again, we're not just talking about one particular structure of documents. DataStore is flexible to enable you to control multiple different types of documents. So I now want to go on to the second of my scenarios around employee management. But before I do, has anybody got any questions about what we've discussed so far with the contract management? No? Okay. I'll get on with the employee side then. So let me switch back into the searching client view, and we'll talk about some of the similar elements that are in place around employee onboarding and how we're managing things. So the idea is we can go and pick up information around particular onboarding process documents that are picked up throughout an onboarding process, and we can go and return those in the same way as we did for the contract documents. So I can go in and identify a particular employment process that's required, and I can go and pull back the information that's associated to it. So if I go in and have a look for a particular job title, I can go and identify all of the documents that I have present for 3 different types of role that I'm trying to fulfill at the moment. So if I go and have a look at what I'm actually storing for my head of sales roles, I can go in and I've got a number of different documents present around those particular roles to, again, identify what's needed. So you can see we've got a number of different document types there, from job descriptions that are being built for particular individuals, requisition forms actually starting the process off, through to identities on resumes and any background checks that have been picked up and processed as well. Again, the idea is that this is potentially severely controlled information that we don't want getting out of an HR environment. So we put a lot of controls around the security aspects as to how those documents can be retrieved. Again, we could start to restrict documents depending on particular access rights, as we've seen previously. We have the full version capabilities here as well, so I can go in and make amendments to a job description and pass that through, making sure those processes are all in place. We can go in and actually store multiple versions of a potential employee's personal details. If we're going through a process of tracking identities and background checks, we can again version those over time as appropriate. So from a security and traceability side, all of the audit capabilities are all in place here as well. We can make sure actually that we want to lock down the fact that I can export or print these documents. They're only to be used inside the system. But we want to make sure that we have full access as to who's pulled those documents back, and the audit trail will give us all of that as well. In terms of how the data is stored, we can also actually silo that data into a discrete repository inside DataStore to allow us to make sure that there's no chance of other people accessing that information, so they can be locked down so only the HR people are able to access those documents. We can also build processes around these documents. So I've shown you how it works for contracts. From a slightly different perspective, I've got another route very similar. I'm not going to walk through it because we've already seen how it works. But we can build a process of how I manage the resumes that are coming through the company. So if I just zoom in on this a little bit. What we have is any resume that comes into the business is identified and put into an in-review state, so HR can go through and review that document, make sure that it's relevant for the particular application that's being performed before it gets passed on to anybody else in the business. So the first thing that happens is we'll route it to HR and they can go and process that information forwards. Because we're actually storing many different types of documents in the same repository, we can also say, well, if it's not a resume, we just want to process it through so it can be made available. So dependent on the document type, we can build in steps in the route that allow us to take certain paths through. Again, all of this is audited and controlled and made available through the processing to give us a clear understanding of how those documents have passed through the system. Based on the role, we can also then divert it through other routes. So where we actually only want to have a manager reviewing a particular resume, the document can be sent to the manager. But where, for potentially if we're employing a CEO, it needs to go through board approval, we can make sure the resumes are also routed to the board for approval as well, based on the types of information that we have around the outside of it. Once that's gone through, as long as everybody approves, we can start to then push that information available into the system to then make it accessible for further on during the process. We talked about integration in the previous set around contracts. We have the same capability, obviously, from the HR side as well. So information around particular people involved in those particular processes or particular reference numbers associated to particular applications can all be picked up and associated to information from an HR system to pull that back. But we can also use this to provide information back to the HR system as documents are going through the process to make sure all that information is available through there. Going back to the compliance and governance side, again, we can build inventories around these documents. So if I go and bring up the inventory for the employees, I can go in here and say, well, in this case, let's have a look at the particular documents I need for an office administrator. And they're going to have a defined set of documents that need to have been provided to allow me to go through with the onboarding process. So firstly, have we got the job description and resume? In this case, we have. We've also done a background check, but we haven't actually requested any references yet. And for this role, I need a certain number of references. So as those come in, I can then store those in the system and make those accessible as well. The final step might be to get the employment contract signed off. Again, there might be another process around employment contracts and reviews internally around exactly what's going to be part of that. And any negotiation with the employee can also be raised at that point as well. But going beyond that, we can again have different sets of inventory for different types of employees. So if I go in here, I can go and have a look and say, well, actually, for our CEO, what do we actually have present for them? In this case, again, I have certain valid documents, but I don't have everything. But in this case, I need more documents. I need to have gone through additional background checks. So have I been through a financial background check, a regulatory background check? Have I gone through particular additional addendums to the contract? Have I got those in place? So in this case, there's a compensation plan associated to this particular contract for this particular role, and the system will help me administer that as well. Obviously, because we can do reporting on this, we can also go in and bring up a description on how we're doing with all our HR activities around employment of particular customers, around documents and how they're being held. It's a very similar presentation to what I showed previously for the contract, so I'm not going to bring that up again. But the idea is all of this is being fed into the relevant reporting systems in the back end, so for audit purposes, for compliance checks, for ensuring that we have the necessary information as we're employing people. All of that can be pulled through and be seen from a high-level overview, as well as the discrete views that we see through this screen here. One other element that I haven't talked about so far is around retention of documents. So how do we take the information that's coming through our system and make sure it's not being held for too long? What I'll do is I'll open up our Management Studio application, which is the main administration suite. But in this case, because I'm working around HR, I have the requirement that I need to put particular retention policies in place around how my data is being managed by the system. So here we can go in and define that for unsuccessful candidates, I can actually go and find and build all of those documents around there to say for particular roles, I need to make sure that I've removed any documents present in the system for particular roles for any candidates that have been unsuccessful. This actually came about from discussions I was having around GDPR when I went to a seminar recently. And they were talking about the fact that one of the low-hanging fruit for anybody going in and doing GDPR compliance checks is to walk into the HR department and say, show me all the candidates who have applied for jobs this year. Now show me all the resumes for those candidates for people that didn't get the role. Okay, you now have that stack of documents. That means you're not GDPR compliant because they haven't removed the documents that were provided for a particular process from the system at the end of that particular process. So while documents might need to be retained if the employee is taken on board, any that are unsuccessful need to be removed. And we can go in and build structures around this inside data store to ensure that documents are removed at an appropriate time if somebody has not been successful, in this case, with a particular employment. But it can also be different retention policies built around different types of documents or different requirements around that. So it may be that you want to hold particular pieces of information more detailed. So if I want to go in and actually identify that I want to remove certain documents earlier on in the process, oops, that was if I click on the right button, that will give me the ability to go in and specify that I want to associate a particular document type to be removed at a particular time. So I could specify that any background checks get removed from the system after a particular date, regardless of what's going on. Or it might be that there needs to be documents held because we have a particular complaint that's been raised against a particular employee, and there's going to be a legal hold placed on those documents. And we can use the retention policies in here to link up to a legal hold system to identify that those documents are being held and ensure they're kept, regardless of any other policies that are put in place around the outside of it. So, in conclusion, which I'm sure you're all very grateful to hear, given that we're now approaching the end of the day. We've seen how data store can support how documents can be controlled through a couple of different scenarios. So through contract management, through employee onboarding. But the idea is that this can apply to any particular scenario that you might have documents that need to be retained for. So in terms of how we're managing those assets, the idea is that data store can give you the flexibility to meet the needs you have today, but also expand to meet those needs tomorrow. It can work with many different types of documents in many different ways. We talked around the security and the audit capabilities of the system to make sure that we have the control in place so the right people are accessing the right information, and we have traceability to ensure that it hasn't been used in an inappropriate fashion. Around the process and integration, we have inbuilt tools to support existing processes, routing documents through approval processes, and we have integration to other systems to make sure that the relevant information is provided back to help those processes be as smooth as possible. And we're also able to report on that around compliance. Have we got the right information present? Have we held the documents correctly? Have we removed those documents when they're no longer valid or no longer appropriate? With that, that's the end of the demonstration portion. So I'll switch back to my slideshow. And ask if there are any questions. No? Super. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Hope that's been of use to you. If you have any questions or want to go through that in any more detail, I'm going to be in the Solution Centre for most of tomorrow, so please feel free to drop in and have a chat about things in a bit more detail, and we can go through any questions you have then. Tom, do you want to wrap us up? Thank you.